My wife declared she makes all the rules at dinner. I secretly planned escape, walked out, took my life back forever, and finally wrote my own rules. "Rules here," she announced with a smirk, glancing at our dinner guests as if to make sure they heard her loud and clear. The statement hung in the air like a guillotine over my dignity. 10 years of marriage had led to this moment. 10 years of slowly surrendering pieces of myself until I barely recognized the man in the mirror. The control hadn't happened overnight. It had crept in slowly, disguised as concern, as preferences, as small suggestions that grew into demands. First it was comments about my clothes, then who I could spend time with, and eventually how I should think. My friends had disappeared, one by one, deemed bad influences or wastes of time. Family visits became increasingly rare, always with some convenient excuse why we couldn't attend gatherings. I remembered when we first met at a company party. Her confidence had drawn me in like a moth to a flame. That same confidence had twisted into something unrecognizable over the years. What once seemed like assertiveness had morphed into dominance. What I mistook for passion had become control. That night, after our guests left, I stood in the kitchen washing dishes while she critiqued how I'd behaved during dinner. Apparently, I had embarrassed her by disagreeing about a political topic. "You know nothing about it," she hissed. "Next time, just keep your mouth shut." I nodded silently, a response that had become automatic. Inside, something finally snapped. The next morning, while she slept, I sat in our backyard watching the sunrise, contemplating how I had become so diminished. How many times had I swallowed my words to keep the peace? How often had I abandoned my own interests because they didn't fit her vision of who I should be? I thought about our recent vacation where she had berated me for chatting too long with a tour guide, accusing me of flirting when I was simply being friendly. At work that day, I couldn't focus. Her words kept echoing. "I make the rules here," as if I were a child, as if my thoughts and feelings meant nothing. During lunch, I called my old college roommate, whom I hadn't spoken to in nearly 2 years. Hearing his voice brought back memories of who I used to be, someone with opinions, hobbies, and laughter. That evening, she came home with shopping bags full of clothes she had bought for me, items I would never have chosen for myself. "Your wardrobe is embarrassing," she declared, throwing the bags on our bed. "These are more appropriate." I thanked her quietly while something inside me screamed. Later that night, she criticized how I loaded the dishwasher, reorganizing it completely while sighing dramatically. When I tried to help, she pushed my hand away. "Just let me do it right," she snapped. Then came the comments about my weight, how I was letting myself go, how I wasn't ambitious enough at work, how my family never had proper manners. As I lay awake that night, listening to her sleep beside me, I realized I had become a guest in my own life. The house we lived in had been decorated entirely to her taste. We ate what she wanted, watched what she preferred, socialized only with her friends. My existence had been whittled down to a supporting role in her story. The next morning, while she was in the shower, I looked at our framed wedding photo. We looked so happy, so equal. I couldn't pinpoint exactly when the balance had shifted, when I had begun to disappear. But I knew with sudden clarity that I couldn't continue disappearing, not for another day. 3 days after that dinner, I sat in a coffee shop across town, nervously waiting. The lawyer arrived precisely on time, dressed casually as I had requested. I didn't want anyone who might know my wife to recognize what was happening. For the first time in years, I was taking action without permission, and the mixture of fear and exhilaration was dizzying. "You need to document everything," the lawyer advised after hearing my situation. "Start keeping records of controlling behavior, financial information, and any instances that could be considered emotional abuse." I nodded. I had already begun a secret journal on my work computer. The lawyer slid a business card across the table. "Call me when you're ready to move forward." That evening, I created a new email account at the public library. The following day, during my lunch break, I opened a separate bank account. Small amounts from my paychecks would now be diverted there, not enough to raise suspicion, but sufficient to build an emergency fund. I researched apartments in a neighborhood she would never visit, and found a modest one-bedroom within my new budget. The most challenging part was maintaining normalcy at home. I continued nodding at her criticisms, agreeing with her decisions, and playing the role I had perfected over the years. But something had changed inside me. I was now an actor conscious of his performance rather than someone who had forgotten he was on stage. I began taking walks alone, claiming doctor's orders for my concerning blood pressure. During these walks, I would call old friends, reconnecting in hushed tones. My brother, whom I hadn't properly spoken to in 3 years because of her dislike of him, broke down when I finally called. "I thought I'd lost you for good," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. 6 weeks into my secret preparations, she announced she was planning a weekend trip with her friends to a spa resort. "You'll be fine on your own, I suppose," she said. More statement than question. I assured her I could manage, and even suggested she extend her trip if she wanted. The house might actually stay clean for a few days, she joked, though we both knew it wasn't really a joke. The night before her departure, I could barely sleep, my mind racing between doubt and determination. Was I overreacting? Was this really necessary? Then she criticized how I had packed her suitcase, emptying it completely to refold everything properly while listing all my deficiencies. The doubt evaporated. After dropping her at her friend's house, I drove straight to the bank. I withdrew half of our joint savings, legally mine the lawyer had confirmed, and deposited it into my new account. Next, I collected the essential documents I had gradually gathered and hidden in my gym locker: birth certificate, passport, insurance information, and copies of tax returns. At home, I packed methodically: clothes, personal items, family photographs, and a few mementos she hadn't deemed tacky and thrown away. I took only what was undeniably mine, leaving no room for accusations of theft. The furniture, electronics, and luxury items could stay. They were merely props in a life I no longer wanted to live. As I loaded the car, our elderly neighbor waved from across the street. For a moment I froze, wondering if he would mention this to her. Then I remembered how she had mocked his senility at our last neighborhood gathering. Some secrets, it seemed, would be kept safe by her own cruelty. With the car loaded, I stood in our living room one last time. Despite having lived there for 7 years, I felt no attachment to the space she had claimed as her domain. I placed my house key in a sealed letter on the kitchen counter. The letter was brief. I was leaving the marriage and would contact her only through my lawyer. No explanations, no accusations, no pleas for understanding. Nothing that could be twisted or used against me. Driving away from that house was like emerging from underwater after nearly drowning. Each mile brought clearer thoughts, fuller breaths. The GPS directed me to my new apartment, but I was already heading somewhere much more important: back to myself. The first night in my new apartment was surreal. I sat on a hastily purchased air mattress surrounded by boxes and silence. No criticism about the takeout I had ordered. No commentary about my choice of music playing softly from my phone. No tension in my shoulders anticipating the next disapproving look. Just quiet. Just peace. My phone remained off. I knew what would happen when she returned home the next evening and found my letter. The thought of her reaction brought conflicting emotions: guilt for the pain I was causing, fear of her rage, but predominantly relief that I wouldn't be there to absorb it. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in years. No lying awake overanalyzing every interaction, rehearsing the right things to say, planning how to navigate her moods. Just darkness and rest. Morning came with momentary disorientation before reality settled in. I had done it. I had actually left. The realization brought a strange lightness to my chest. I made coffee exactly how I liked it, stronger than she would ever permit, and stood by the window watching the city wake up. My new neighborhood was modest but lively. From my third-floor window, I could see a small park where people walked their dogs and children played. It was nothing like our meticulously maintained suburban street, where neighbors rarely interacted except to compare lawn care. I spent that day setting up my new space. The apartment was small, just one bedroom with a combined living and dining area, but it was mine. I arranged my books on a simple shelf, books that had been banished to the garage at our old house for being unsightly. I hung a print by my favorite artist that she had deemed tasteless years ago. Around noon, I finally turned on my phone, ignoring the main screen and navigating directly to my brother's contact. I did it. "I'm out," I texted him. His response came immediately: "Proud of you. Need anything?" Such simple words, yet they filled my eyes with tears. How long had it been since someone had asked what I needed? By evening, she would be arriving home, finding the letter, discovering my absence. I turned my phone off again and walked to a nearby cinema, choosing a science fiction film she would have mocked. For 2 hours, I lost myself in another world, eating popcorn without being reminded of the calories. When I returned to my apartment, I felt an unfamiliar sensation. It took me a moment to identify it. I was humming. The simple, unconscious expression of contentment had been absent from my life for so long I had forgotten how it felt. Sunday morning brought the inevitable. When I finally turned my phone on, it exploded with notifications: 27 missed calls, 43 text messages, 5 voicemails. I didn't read or listen to any of them. Instead, I called my lawyer as instructed, confirming that I had left and the barrage had begun. "Don't respond directly," he advised. "Forward everything to me. We'll establish that all communication must go through proper channels." I did as instructed, feeling a strange detachment as I forwarded the digital avalanche of her rage without absorbing it. By afternoon, a new tactic emerged. Messages from mutual friends began appearing. "She's worried sick about you. She doesn't understand what happened. At least tell her you're safe." I recognized the pattern immediately. She was mobilizing others to pull me back, just as she had done whenever I tried to establish boundaries in the past. I responded with brief, factual messages. "I am safe. This was a deliberate decision. I appreciate your concern, but my lawyer will handle all communication regarding the situation." Some expressed shock at the mention of a lawyer. Others promised to stay out of it. A few revealed their true allegiance with immediate defensiveness on her behalf. Monday brought the challenge of returning to work. I had taken a personal day for the move but couldn't hide forever. I arrived early and requested a private meeting with my manager. I kept the explanation professional. "I'm going through a separation and wanted you to be aware in case there are any disruptions." His understanding nod suggested this wasn't the first time he had heard such news. Throughout that first day back, I maintained focus on my tasks, though my mind occasionally drifted to my new reality. During lunch, I sat alone in a nearby park, watching leaves scatter in the autumn breeze. A text from an unknown number arrived. "You think this is over? You've made the biggest mistake of your life." I forwarded it to my lawyer without reading it twice, and returned to watching the leaves, refusing to let her pull me back into the storm. By the end of the first week, her tactics had evolved with frightening predictability. The initial rage gave way to tearful pleas. "I don't understand what happened. We can fix this. Please just talk to me." These messages were harder to ignore than the angry ones. They pulled at the part of me that had been conditioned to comfort her, to fix things, to take responsibility for her emotional state. My lawyer advised complete silence. "Any direct communication now will only open the door for manipulation," he warned. I knew he was right, but each ignored message felt like another small betrayal on my part. The rational side of my brain understood this was exactly how she had controlled me for years, by making me feel responsible for her feelings. 10 days after my departure, she showed up at my workplace. I was in a meeting when the receptionist called to say my wife was in the lobby, insisting on seeing me immediately. My heart raced as my manager nodded for me to handle the situation. In the elevator down, I texted my lawyer, who responded instantly. "Do not engage in any discussion about your relationship. State clearly that all communication must go through legal channels. If she persists, walk away." She stood in the center of the lobby, perfectly put together as always, designer handbag clutched in white-knuckled hands. The moment she saw me, her face transformed from angry determination to wounded vulnerability, a transition I had witnessed countless times before. "We need to talk," she stated, loud enough for the receptionist to hear but soft enough to seem reasonable. "Not here. Any communication needs to go through my lawyer," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "I forwarded his contact information to you." Her eyes narrowed slightly, the mask of vulnerability slipping. "So that's how it's going to be? After 10 years, I don't even deserve a conversation?" Something about her phrasing struck me. Deserve. As if talking to me was a prize she was entitled to, as if my silence was taking something that belonged to her. I simply repeated, "Please contact my lawyer," and turned to leave. "Everyone thinks you've lost your mind," she called after me, voice rising. "Running away in the middle of the night like a coward. What kind of man does that?" I stopped, not turning around. This was the moment that would set the tone for everything that followed. I could defend myself, explain myself, argue exactly what she wanted, or I could continue walking exactly what she couldn't stand. I chose the latter. That night, she escalated to showing up at my apartment. How she found the address, I wasn't sure. Possibly through a mutual acquaintance who thought they were helping. I didn't answer the door despite her persistent knocking. Eventually, a neighbor must have complained, because the knocking stopped, followed by the distant wail of a police siren. The next morning, my lawyer called. "She's filed a motion claiming you abandoned the marriage and absconded with joint property," he explained. "We expected this. I've prepared our response, demonstrating that you took only what was rightfully yours and left her with the majority of joint assets. However, you should expect things to get more difficult before they get easier." The following weeks proved him right. She contested everything, the separation terms, the division of assets, even access to our dog that she had always complained about walking or feeding. Friends were forced to choose sides. Most chose hers, after hearing whatever version of events she had crafted. I lost people I thought would remain in my life, but I also discovered unexpected allies. My brother drove 6 hours to spend a weekend helping me settle into my new place. A colleague invited me to a hiking group that met on Saturdays. My elderly aunt called weekly just to check in. Small connections formed a safety net I hadn't realized I needed. 1 month after my departure, a mutual friend reached out to inform me that she was extremely concerned about my mental health and was thinking of requesting a wellness check. I thanked them for the information, recognizing the thinly veiled threat for what it was. I proactively scheduled sessions with a therapist, both for my own benefit and to establish a record of my mental stability. After several sessions, the therapist put it plainly, "What you're describing is consistent with someone recovering from an emotionally controlling relationship, not someone experiencing a breakdown." 6 weeks in, she tried a new approach. I received an email directly from her personal account, the first breach of the lawyer-only communication rule. The subject line read simply, "I'm sorry." The message detailed all the ways she now recognized her behavior had been controlling. She promised therapy, couples counseling, complete change. It was everything I had once dreamed of hearing. My finger hovered over the reply button, heart pounding. Then I noticed something. The apology focused entirely on what she would lose without me. My income, my help around the house, my steady presence. Not once did it mention my happiness or well-being. Not once did it acknowledge me as a person rather than a resource. With shaking hands, I forwarded it to my lawyer without replying. That night, I dreamed of going back. In the dream, she welcomed me with open arms, promising everything would be different. I woke up in a cold sweat, momentarily disoriented, reaching across the bed for someone who wasn't there. The emptiness beside me felt momentarily devastating, until I remembered the emptiness I had felt while lying next to her, which had been infinitely worse. 3 months into my new life, small changes began accumulating into something transformative. I noticed it first in photographs. A friend from the hiking group captured a candid shot of me at the summit of a local trail, laughing at something someone had said. When he shared it in our group chat, I barely recognized myself. The tension that had permanently resided in my face had softened. My smile reached my eyes in a way it hadn't for years. Physical changes followed. Without her constant monitoring of my diet, the subtle pushes toward food she deemed appropriate and away from things I enjoyed, I began eating what I wanted, when I wanted. Surprisingly, I found myself naturally gravitating toward healthier options now that food wasn't a battleground. The perpetual knot in my stomach had dissolved, and with it the digestive issues I had attributed to aging. I rediscovered old hobbies. The vintage motorcycle I had kept in storage, a restoration project she had dismissed as childish, was brought to my apartment building's designated parking space. Weekends were now spent with grease-stained hands and YouTube tutorials rather than attending social functions where I felt like an accessory. The bike had been the only thing she never managed to make me get rid of, though not for lack of trying. My apartment gradually transformed from a temporary shelter into a home. Walls that were initially bare now displayed artwork I genuinely appreciated. Bookshelves filled with volumes I actually read, rather than impressive-looking hardcovers chosen for their spines. Furniture arranged for comfort rather than appearance. Nothing matched perfectly, yet everything felt harmonious because it reflected one consistent taste, mine. Work performance improved dramatically. Without expending mental energy anticipating potential criticisms at home, I could focus completely on projects, a promotion I had been hesitant to pursue, knowing it would require more hours and trigger accusations of prioritizing work over her, now seemed attainable. I applied and was selected for a leadership position that increased both my responsibilities and compensation. The legal proceedings continued with periodic updates from my lawyer. She contested everything possible, dragging out what could have been a straightforward separation. "This isn't about the assets," my lawyer observed after a particularly contentious negotiation session. "This is about control." I nodded, understanding completely. The longer she could keep us legally entangled, the longer she maintained a connection she could pull on. Through mutual connections, I heard fragments about her life. She had crafted a narrative casting herself as the abandoned victim of my midlife crisis. Initially, this garnered her significant sympathy and support. People brought her meals, checked in regularly, offered shoulders to cry on. She thrived on the attention, expanding her social media presence with vague, poetic posts about betrayal and resilience. As months passed, however, Her support system began showing signs of fatigue. The constant drama, the unrelenting victimhood, the demands for emotional labor wore down even her most dedicated allies. Invitations decreased. Response times to her messages lengthened. The audience for her performance of suffering gradually dispersed. Professionally, she struggled as well. Her position at a prestigious firm had always been bolstered by the dinner parties we hosted for colleagues and clients, events where I played the role of supportive spouse. Without those social connections, her natural tendency toward sharp criticism became more apparent in workplace interactions. A mutual acquaintance mentioned she had been passed over for a partnership track that had once seemed guaranteed. I took no pleasure in these reports, yet they confirmed something important. Her struggles weren't because she missed me specifically, but because she missed what I provided. Stability, social facilitation, a consistent emotional punching bag, someone to control. The distinction helped dissolve any lingering guilt about my decision to leave. 6 months after my departure, I received an invitation to a college friend's wedding. The please reply included a +1 option that stared back at me from my computer screen. For a moment, an old programming kicked in, the automatic calculation of how she would react to the event, who would be there that she disapproved of, what I would need to do to minimize her displeasure. Then I remembered I could simply attend and enjoy myself. I went alone, though several friends from the hiking group had jokingly offered to be my date. The ceremony was beautiful, but what struck me most was the reception. I danced. I laughed loudly. I had seconds of cake. I stayed until the very end, helping stack chairs when most guests had departed. Not once did I check my phone anxiously or monitor the time with growing dread about potential accusations of staying out too late. Driving home that night, windows down and music playing, I was struck by a realization so simple yet profound it nearly forced me to pull over. I was happy. Not temporarily distracted from unhappiness, not comparatively less miserable than before, but genuinely content in a sustained way I had forgotten was possible. The next morning I called my lawyer. "I'm ready to be generous in the final settlement," I told him. "I want this finished." He cautioned about setting a precedent of giving in to her demands. But I clarified, this isn't about giving her what she wants. It's about giving myself what I need, freedom to move forward without her shadow trailing behind me. That afternoon, I changed my phone number, the final cord connecting her to my daily life. As the automated message confirmed the switch was complete, I felt a weight lift that I hadn't realized I was still carrying. The rules had changed. I was making them now. 1 year to the day after I walked out, the divorce was finalized. The papers arrived by courier on a Thursday morning before work. I signed for the package but left it unopened on my kitchen counter and headed to the office as usual. Throughout the day, the knowledge of its presence waited for me like a guest in my home. Not an unwelcome one, but one that deserved proper attention. That evening, I opened a bottle of wine I had been saving. Not to celebrate exactly, but to mark the occasion with appropriate significance. The legal language was cold and impersonal, reducing 10 years to assets distributed and obligations terminated. I signed where indicated, following the yellow tabs placed by my lawyer. My hand didn't shake, my eyes remained dry. The emotion I felt wasn't grief or regret, but something quieter, acknowledgement of an ending that had been necessary. The following weekend, my brother and his family visited. My niece and nephew, now comfortable in my presence after multiple visits throughout the year, immediately claimed my living room for an elaborate fort construction. My sister-in-law prepared dinner in my kitchen while my brother and I sat on the balcony watching the sunset with beers in hand. "You know what I noticed?" he said, breaking a comfortable silence. "What's that?" "You interrupt people now," he continued at my confused look. "In a normal way, I mean. You jump in with your thoughts instead of waiting for permission to speak. You disagree openly. You don't look around for approval before laughing at something." He took a swig of his beer. "It's good to have my brother back." His observations stayed with me long after they left. I began noticing other changes in myself, standing straighter, speaking more confidently in meetings, making decisions without second-guessing. My therapist called it reclaiming personal authority. I called it remembering who I was. The divorce settlement had left me with less financial security than I had entered the marriage with, but the freedom was worth every penny. My new apartment, initially chosen for practicality and anonymity, had become a place I genuinely loved. I had made friends with neighbors, become a regular at local businesses, established roots that felt authentic. Professionally, the leadership position continued to challenge and reward me. My team respected my management style, collaborative rather than controlling, firm but flexible. The irony wasn't lost on me. By escaping someone who needed to make all the rules, I had become someone who could guide others without dominance. Dating remained low on my priority list. Several friends had made well-intentioned attempts at setting me up, but I declined politely. This wasn't from fear or lingering attachment, but from genuine contentment with my current life and a desire to fully establish my independence before potentially merging it with someone else's. Therapy had helped me understand the patterns that had led to my marriage and its deterioration. My natural tendency to accommodate others had made me a perfect target for someone who needed constant accommodation. My reluctance to confront conflict had allowed small boundary violations to cascade into complete control. These insights didn't excuse her behavior, but they helped me recognize my part in enabling it, knowledge that would protect me in future relationships. 10 months into my new life, I began volunteering with a support group for men leaving controlling relationships. The organization was small but growing, addressing a need often overlooked by existing support systems. My role was simple: listen without judgment, share my experience when relevant, remind these men that their feelings were valid and their desire for autonomy was legitimate. The work was emotionally demanding but deeply fulfilling. Each story I heard contained echoes of my own experience, yet each man's journey was uniquely his own. Some had children complicating their situations. Some faced financial hardships that made leaving seem impossible. Some struggled with religious or cultural expectations that kept them trapped. All deserved the support I had been fortunate enough to receive. 13 months after leaving, I encountered her unexpectedly. A new restaurant had opened downtown, and I was dining with colleagues when she walked in with a man I didn't recognize. She spotted me immediately. For a moment, time seemed suspended as our eyes met across the room. I nodded politely and returned to my conversation, but my peripheral vision caught her continued stare. Later, as my group was preparing to leave, she approached our table alone. My colleagues, sensing tension, created a buffer of small talk before tactfully moving toward the exit, leaving us in a bubble of artificial privacy amid the restaurant noise. "You look well," she said, her tone suggesting this was somehow offensive. "Thank you. You too." A silence stretched between us, filled with unspoken accusations and defenses. She broke first. Was it worth it, throwing away 10 years? The question was designed as a trap, inviting either confirmation that would fuel her victimhood or denial that would suggest regret on my part. Instead, I chose a different path. "I wish you happiness," I said simply. "I mean that." Her expression flickered between anger and confusion. This wasn't the script she had prepared for. Before she could recalibrate, I excused myself to join my waiting colleagues. Walking to our cars afterward, a coworker asked the inevitable question. "Ex-wife?" "Yes," I replied. That looked intense. I considered the assessment and found it inaccurate. Actually, it wasn't. And that was perhaps the most significant realization of all. The encounter that should have been emotionally devastating had instead been merely awkward. The power she once held over my emotional state had dissolved completely. That night, I stood on my balcony looking at the city lights, contemplating the strange circular nature of life. 1 year ago, I had been sleepwalking through existence, allowing someone else to dictate my reality. Now I stood fully awake, author of my own story, making my own rules. The woman who had once bragged about ruling our shared life now had no jurisdiction over any part of mine. The irony was both perfect and complete. In attempting to control everything, she had ultimately controlled nothing, left to rule over an empty kingdom of her own making. Meanwhile, I had discovered that the only rulebook worth following was the one written by my own hand, guided by self-respect that no one could take unless I freely surrendered it. And I would never surrender it again.